Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry reading series called Poets Corner in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them for an hour or so around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Dionysius, who will read poems and talk on the theme of war music. Fittingly, this podcast is being published on Anzac Day. For those viewing it from outside Australia, the Anzacs are the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Anzac Day is a national day of remembrance in Australia and New Zealand that broadly commemorates all Australians and New Zealanders who served and died in all wars, conflicts and peacekeeping operations, and the contribution and suffering of all those who have served. It begins typically with dawn services around the country and in places like Gallipoli in Turkey, and is followed by an Anzac Day parade where servicemen and women march to remember and honour their fallen comrades. As always, I start with an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Brett is recording from Brisbane or Meanjin. I would like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Jagera and Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of the land in Brisbane or Meanjin, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. B.R. Dionysius was founding director of the Queensland Poetry Festival. His poetry has been widely published in literary journals, anthologies, newspapers and online. He is the author of one artist's book, The Barflies Chorus, 1995 Lyrebird Press, 4 poetry collections, Fatherlands, 2000 Five Islands Press, Bacchanalia, 2002 Interactive Press, Bowra, 2013 Whitmore Press, and Weranga, 2013 Walleah Press. A verse novel, UniversalAndalusia, 2006 SOI 3, and 2 chapbooks, The Negativity Bin, 2010 PressPress, and The Curious Noise of History, 2011 Picaro Press. He won the 2009 Max Harris Poetry Award, was joint winner of the 2011 Whitmore Press Manuscript Prize, and was shortlisted in the 2017 Montreal International Poetry Prize, amongst many other awards and prizes. His 9th collection, The Wet Tropics, will be published in September 2022 by the Calanth Collective, Mount Tamborine, Queensland. He lives in Brisbane, teaches English, and in his spare time, assuming he has some, watches birds. Hi, Brett, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. Thank you for inviting me to speak today and read some poetry on Poets Corners. And a big thank you to WestWords for your support of poets and poetry in this country.
Yeah, no, we love this. We love this show, and we love having poets from around the country on it. Now, you've told me that your theme, war music, is inspired by Christopher Logue's translation of some of the books of the Iliad. Would you like to elaborate a bit on that source of inspiration?
Oh, okay. I've actually got it here. Show and tell.
There you go.
Here's it's a Faber and Faber edition, Christopher Logue, published 2001. So that's kind of an interesting date. If you look at the world calendar on kind of like the war on terror, I guess, started in that year, and so did the publication of this translation, kind of adaptation of some of the books in Homer's Iliad. What I like about this kind of verse novel, I guess, is its just use of free verse poetry, to tell the story of Achilles and Patroclus and Paris and Menelaus and all of the those soldiers and heroes from the Iliad. So it's kind of like, it's very conversational language. It's it doesn't have, that kind of that rhythm of traditional kind of translations of the Iliad. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like an adaptation for the 21st century as we broke it into that era. So yeah, and it kind of like, my style of writing, I guess, being free verse, non-rhyming, kind of, short, pithy, powerful kind of language. It appeals to me in that way. So yeah.
Well, I was just wondering whether you were drawn to the theme because of any personal or family relationships to people who have served.
No, not really. Funnily enough, my ancestry is German on both sides of my family. Like, we're talking late 19th century, fourth generation Australian roots, back in like the Baltic, Greifswald, the Isle of Rügen, and Poznan, which is now in Poland, of course, on both sides of the family. An interesting little story. My great-grandfather, who jumped ship in South Brisbane Harbour in about 1886 with his brother and made their home in Queensland. They went out west to kind of the Lockyer Valley, where there were German families farming already, with the German settlement in Australia. And what he did when World War I came around, he donned his merchant sailor's uniform in Laidley and sort of marched up and down the street singing German kind of maritime songs in his sailor's suit. And the locals thought, nah, that's not a good look. So they hid him and kind of told him to stop doing that, and rather than face internment, being of German heritage. So, but no relatives who kind of fought in, the major conflicts of the 20th century. Although my father was called up for, he's a Nasho, so he, did his national service training in 1950, 1951 during the Korean War crisis. So, but he was never called up to serve in Korea, thankfully. Otherwise, I may not be here. So, but they were farmers. My people are farmers, I guess. So they fed the troops. There was that kind of distinction that people had to remain on the land as well and do the farming, I guess, to feed the war effort. And you see that interestingly in the Ukraine today, in the Ukraine-Russian crisis. There was an interview with Ukrainian farmers. I mean, they're very busy recovering Russian tanks and selling them for scrap metal and pouring them back into the Ukrainian army. But Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and you see this pressure now on farmers who need to start cultivating and start planting, and there's a war going on. And it's kind of like me being from the country originally, from a farm, where cultivation was uninterrupted and, it was just a process that happened. It's kind of like my heart goes out to ordinary people who are just trying to, do their day-to-day job but can't because war comes along. War music, starts up and, they can't be heard.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about ordinary people, several of the poems you're going to read today are about individual soldiers and nurses.
Yeah.
It sort of made me do a little bit of research when I read the poems. I know that there are many biographical records on soldiers through the Australian War Memorial and elsewhere. What drew you to the stories of the soldiers and nurses that you have written about here, and how much research did you do to write these poems?
Okay, so when I was in 2006, I was living in Stafford, which is a suburb in the north of Brisbane, and just across the road from where I was living, there was a park, Brisbane City Council Park, and it was called the Kevin Payne VC Memorial Park. And with my children, I used to go there, and they used to play, and I used to have a look at the memorial there, the cenotaph, and it was dedicated to Keith Payne, who lived in Stafford for a while. He's a Queensland, Victoria Cross recipient from the Vietnam War, and so this park was named in his honour. But on the cenotaph were all the names of all the VC winners from Australia's wars, all 100 of them. And I thought, oh, 100's a neat figure. I like that. Wow, I like that. But back in 2006, I probably wrote just 4 kind of sonnets from the 4 VC winners from the Vietnam War. Okay, that was the start of this project. So that was the genesis, 2006, this park, looking at these names.
So it was almost accidental.
Yeah, almost accidental. Although, I have a history, I like military history. I do like, kind of military history, that kind of thing, reading about war. And from there, not a lot happened until, the centenary of the Great War. So we're talking about 2014 to 2018. I came back to those 4 original sonnets, and I just thought, you know what? A sonnet for each person who won the VC. I'll do that as my kind of, I don't know, token gift to the centenary. And I had hoped to have the collection published. And I had this fanciful idea that the Australian War Memorial could publish it. Here's 100 sonnets on these 100 people.
I just thought of that when you were telling me that. And I thought, well, it's not so fanciful. That was the first thing that occurred to me.
Well, and I sent them a proposal and a project, and the Australian War Memorial kindly, they replied and said that, we only publish work by people who work at the Australian War Memorial. So historians who work for the memorial, they publish their work only, not work from people outside. So it was kind of like I had this idea of almost like not a coffee table book, but kind of like a photo of the person, the citation for what they did to win the Victoria Cross, and then my sonnet. Sort of like a trio of kind of things on a page. And I thought, that'd be really, really, really great. But it never happened. But I completed it anyway. And just getting back to your question, there was research involved with looking into the lives of these people. And I was particularly, for this project, and the extended metaphor that I've used in every sonnet is taken from the occupation that the person had before they joined the war and fought or died or lived. So the sonnet, the imagery, the metaphors, the extended metaphor, it's based on their occupation they had, because obviously, Boer War, World War One, very ordinary people who had careers as lawyers, as teachers, as foresters, as tradesmen, as doctors. They had other lives before they joined the Great War and the Boer War, even World War II. And so that was very helpful in kind of describing, and the sonnets actually just kind of describe the action. So it's kind of like the citation turned into a sonnet of what they did to win their Victoria Cross. So I found that an interesting or useful technique for me to, because it was 100, because look at it, it's 100 poems of people doing basically the same thing. There's 2 ways to win the Victoria Cross. You either kill a lot of people or you save a lot of lives. Yeah. Or sometimes you do a mixture of both. In killing a lot of people, you save a lot of lives. So that repeated 100 times, it's kind of like, who's going to read this? It's just it's more of the same.
So the occupations gave you the framework, but also, gave depth to the personas, because, you don't want to be defined by simply one thing.
Yeah. And look, I chose the sonnet form. That's 14 lines, and it's very hard to get the life of a person into 14 lines, particularly, winners of the Victoria Cross or anyone for that matter. So I did do research on their lives for all 100 of them. And obviously what happened to them after the war as well. Sometimes that feeds back into the sonnets. I do write historically, and I do write narrative poems. I mean, that's kind of my forte, I guess. I love, I don't really write about myself. I'm not a big fan of the lyric I, although I use the lyric I, but obviously, someone else's perspective in the poem. I prefer to write kind of narratively, to tell stories about ordinary people. And what happens to them, whether it's war, whether it's, you know, some sort of adversity, or whether it's, you know, about the environment as well. So I mean, that's just my preference.
Well, let's hear one.
Okay. So what I've got today is kind of like a chronological grouping of poems that goes from World War I right through to the War on Terror and Australia's involvement in Afghanistan. So probably the scope of these poems goes from about 1915 to 2012. Okay, so, you know, we've got, I guess, a glance at you know, the 20th and a bit into the 21st century. The first poem is called Second Lieutenant Hugo Vivian Hope Throssell. 29th to 30th of August, 1915, Hill 60, Gallipoli Peninsula, Turkey. The rising sun badge was embedded in the flesh of his shoulder. It pinched his muscle like a meat hook spiked through a carcass. Someone thrust a cigarette between his blackened fingers, but he couldn't lift up his arms anymore. They had seized like an engine, the bloodied muscles stiffening as though he'd been lifting hay bales all day. Bomb splinters stuck in his forehead like pig's teeth in a tree, or the first stub of horn on a bully calf. His face was a red rag, but they'd won the crazed game of cricket, throwing the Turks' ball grenades back at them all night long. In Palestine, he passed into a scene from Bruegel. He crawled over the dead, whistling for his lost brother. He hooted their secret childhood tune until his lips succumbed to drought. The war left him fallow.
Yeah, so when I read this, obviously I knew that it was a sonnet. I didn't know that it was part of 100 sonnets, but I went and had a look at the story of
Throssell, yeah.
Throssell, and I was really taken by the economy of the poem, how you capture so much of your story in so few words, exemplified, I think, by the last, you know, devastating words, the war left him fallow. I was going to ask you, was this a longer poem that you whittled down to its final sonnet form, but clearly it wasn't. But how did you manage to compress that into 14 lines?
I wish I knew. It's the secret of writing contemporary sonnets for me. It is just, you know, I write a lot of sonnets, you might know. Yes. Contemporary sonnets, I call them, or free verse sonnets. It's kind of like, you know, after doing it for so long, you know, I kind of get into a zone where it's not a longer piece that's whittled down. It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of like atoms spinning together that coalesce into 14 lines. Yes, it's based on research, and, you know, the extended metaphor in there. So as you probably found out, Throssell, you know, very, very famous VC winner from Western Australia, married, you know, Catherine Susanna Pritchard, famous Western Australian novelist and communist, and, you know, he was a veteran, a Victoria Cross holder, who then, you know, in Perth starts to speak out against the war and you know, claims that the war turned him into a socialist, and at the time, you know, becomes very unpopular in his views. You know, people couldn't gel with, oh, here's a Victoria Cross winner, someone who, you know, the empire, you know, deemed worthy of the highest award for bravery, and yet he's spouting like anti-war, pacifist, socialist kind of ideals, and that didn't go down well for him. And
there's another poem in that.
Well, there could be a whole verse novel in his life and his you know, marriage to Pritchard, and you know, and so the extended metaphor here is taken from his like farming grazier kind of, you know, because they established a farm, you know, in Western Australia, and you know, he tried to make a go of that, and it was, you know, it was tough. There was drought, and there was obviously his reputation became tarnished, you know, like a medal left out in the sun or something. It became tarnished, and it was very hard for him, and to raise money. He fell into debt, and famously, he had a rodeo on his property. I think it was for a charity to raise donations, and he ended up having to pay for 2,000 guests or something, all from his own pocket. He couldn't, there was some law or something that prevented him from taking money off people. So he got further into debt and into despair, and tragically ends his life in 1933.
Yes. But the thing that struck me, if I was writing the poem, I would not know how to have avoided mentioning that there were 3,000 bombs that were tossed back. Because that was extraordinary when I read about it. These bombs were going backwards and forwards all night long.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we conceive of battle, I guess there's lots of computer games, and one of the poems I mentioned that that kind of aspect. When people conceive of a battle, it's kind of, I don't know, maybe it's in short bursts, like people don't really understand the length of time, particularly in World War One, that combat lasted. You're fighting nonstop for 3 days, without sleep, without stopping, sometimes without food, without water, often running out of ammo. It's just inconceivable the human effort and resilience and persistence, I guess, in combat. And again, we're seeing that in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Mariupol, right at the moment where, the Ukrainian Marines are making a last stand. I mean, that's very World War One. And I was just thinking before, we're seeing a lot of parallels to World War One in this 2022 conflict. I mean, there's lots of video footage of Ukrainians digging trenches, and obviously digging in, fortifying against the forthcoming Russian assault. And if it's the Donbass, the war that's been going on since 2014. So we're back to trench warfare. And we're back to, again, it's the spring rain. It's the ground is thawing in the Ukraine, so it's that mud. It's like the Somme. It's like that.
Yeah.
It's the mud is back, and the mud bogs you down, and it tires you out. And in this poem, Throstle and a couple of other VC winners also had a similar experience because of, I guess, a bit of sporting prowess. Australians, playing cricket, playing AFL, playing union or league, or good hand-eye coordination. There are accounts of men like Throstle, for 8 or 9 hours straight, tossing grenades at enemy trenches that are not too far away from each other, but also catching grenades in mid-flight and then just tossing them back. Not just one, just repeatedly, like cricket practice. And that's insane. That's a surreal image of warfare. And at the end of it, when the assault is defeated, a counterattack is warded off, or your assault is finished, just the utter collapse of humanity, exhaustion. People can't lift their arms up because they're just so tired. So the poem tries to get in that effect on the person, on the human, the physical condition, but also what he did. And he was wounded in that action. He was wounded twice. He was, I think, in the hand and the hip. He was seriously wounded, and he should have taken himself off to the medical tent to have a look at it. But often, in the midst of battle, there's adrenaline, it's kicked in, but it's also that duty and responsibility to his men. A lot of officers just refused to leave the field even after they were seriously wounded, because they cared about the welfare of their men and looking after them. So that's also, something that's stuck with me, is just, people's responsibility to each other in a dire situation like combat. Like the kind of and that's the cultural belief, the mateship, I guess, stems from those kind of actions. where you are selfless and you kind of like, you know, look after others around you. So yeah, Throstle was an interesting character. And unfortunately, you know, the war took its toll, farming took its toll on him at the end of his life.
Let's have another poem.
Okay. This is the next year. Private Thomas Cook. There's an asterisk beside his name because, yeah, he was awarded the VC posthumously. So in the collection, there's, you know, quite a few of the soldiers have the asterisk beside them. There were 60 Victoria Crosses awarded for Australian soldiers in World War One. Private Thomas Cook, he was from England via New Zealand via Australia. Like, so he was, and he was described himself, you know, on the enlistment sheet as a bushman. So that was his trade, that was his occupation, a bushman. Mm. This is 24th, 25th of July, 1916, Pozières, France. His Lewis machine gun was still glowing red hot, like the dying embers of a campfire, when the rest of the battalion found him. Smoke lifted from its barrel, as though its firing pin was a tiny blacksmith's forge that had banged out its 303 rounds in a bellows rush of superheated air. Or a sleeping dragon's thin exhalation of steam sliding from a gap in its fiery maw. The drum pan magazine hissed like a saucepan boiling dry on the stove. 81 men from the 8th lay with him, their bodies cooling death's internal mechanism, like the gun's aluminium barrel casing. Cook had fired on alone, holding the trench after his team were dead. It was an issue of supreme design, both man and gun utterly reliable to the end.
Yeah, so one aspect of war is what it reveals about character. And, you know, some of these poems are very much about that. But how tricky is it to write a poem like this where you reflect on Private Cook's character whilst not glorifying either him or the war?
Yeah, my aim was to be kind of neutral in, you know, not overly glorifying, just kind of telling it as it happened. And that's pretty much, you know, what happened to Private Cook, age 35, you know, so he wasn't, you know, he was, yeah, it's you know, it's to me, it's a very sad poem, you know, and it just kind of like reveals kind of the true horror of World War One combat. You know, Australia lost 60,000 troops in World War One, and you know, double that were wounded. You know, so another 120,000, and then, you know, in the decade after the end of World War One, 60,000 more veterans die from their injuries received during the Great War. So you've got all up directly affected by World War One, 250,000 Australians, either KIA, MIA, you know, wounded, and also what you know, sometimes I don't think people realise, Australia had a population of between 4 and 5 million in 1914 to 1918, not the 26 million we have today. And if you look at it, you know, what 250,000 is a percentage of 5 million, you know, we're talking about what, maybe 5% of Australians were directly affected by the war, like either serving, dying, wounded, nursing, logistics, like for such a small nation. And that's why I guess we have, you know, we have a war memorial in every small town in this nation, every country town, every city, every place where people call home, there's a cenotaph, there's a memorial, because almost every single part of Australia, you know, offered up someone to the Great War. And that's just mind-blowing. It really is. That kind of, that sacrifice. And, someone like Cook, who, was kind of, momentarily Australian. I mean, he enlisted in the AIF here, and I guess, that granted him, part of the Anzac tradition. I just wonder, did he have a chance to escape and save his own life? When that obviously it was a German offensive on his position. Was there a moment when he could have escaped and saved himself, or how strong is the pull of duty? Like, what made him stay? Everyone's dead around him. His machine gun team is dead. 80 of his battalion are lying around him. And what would make someone stay? Yeah. So, as I said before, there are 14 lines here that could probably ask more questions than they answer, really, about the lives of these men and their sacrifice.
That's what poetry does, isn't it?
Yeah.
Questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we do. So, someone reads this and then go, hopefully they go away, look up, Private Thomas Cook and his life and how meaningful was that sacrifice. Obviously, very meaningful to a lot of people, with the Anzac tradition. And again, people would have had to piece together his last action, his last stand, it looked like. There's also, in some of the VC winners, some of their stories, they're often found alone, but with a lot of the enemy around them, who they took with them. So it's kind of like, imagine coming on that scene. Yeah, I don't know. I find that a very, very, and he's not alone in that action. And there are many, many soldiers who would have been doing the same thing and were never, kind of awarded a Medal of Gallantry for a very similar thing. And that's also something that, sometimes goes unrecognized, that this would have been happening, all throughout the war, throughout all wars. A lot of unacknowledged people would have done a very similar thing.
So your next poem is in France, set in France.
Yeah, this is... okay, so the other thing I do, I kind of write sometimes, in non-human perspectives. I do that a lot with my environmental writing, my eco-poetry, that kind of thing. I take on the voices of animals, endangered animals, extinct animals even. This one's kind of in the voice of the ammunition manufactured during the Great War. And again, it just reminds me of, Vladimir Zelensky's, now famous quote, I need ammunition, not a ride, So it goes back to that kind of, this idea of giving voice to something that is voiceless. And this is, it's called the annual iron harvest, because again, farmers in France are still ploughing up shells from World War I. And sometimes those shells go off. And so these weapons still have a killing power more than a century after they're buried and forgotten. They're still rising to the top in cultivation and harming people. So it's kind of like, that's the point of view. So it's called the annual iron harvest. And if you see images of this, sometimes farmers will, dig up the shell and just put it to the side of the road. Like imagine that, you're a 21st century farmer. You strike something, you think it's a rock. You look under, the wheels of your tractor at, the harrow, and it's like, oh no, it's a bomb. It's a shell. It's unexploded ordnance. And then you pick it up and you put it on the side of the road for the French army to come along and collect, for the diffusing team to. But yeah, it blows my mind, I guess. The annual iron harvest. Women birthed us through canals of factories, conveyor belt placentas that slipped shiny creations out of furnaces in an afterbirth of weaponry. Poster girls for fast production. Some signed their initials or wrote messages to the future in grease pencil, collecting signatures in their brass-lidded stationery. These black Demeters, planting anti-seeds within the fertile ground. 1/3 of our heirloom grains refused to germinate over 4 seasons of reaping. Each new spring, French farmers plough up our stagnant husks, dud shells heavier than mammoth tusks, taller than workers who did the machining. Try cultivating a minefield the size of an English county. Chisel ploughs drive bayonet deep into blood-dark soil, skewer our dormant bulbs, trigger ripples. We know our iron ancestry. Rust blight covers artillery taproots, weakening our cell sheath. Blades slip into rib cages. Old fuses produce new cripples. 5 ways we can kill you all at once. Kinetic energy, pressure wave, splinters, sound and shock. Skulls forced into the chest as if by a blow from a club. Wheat fields sown with arsenic grow nothing after a century of lying fallow. The Great War turned France's green forests into drought-stricken scrub. There's a section in France, maybe it's the Somme, it's called the Red Zone. And even today, you're still not allowed to go there because of the amount of unexploded ordnance lying around in the Red Zone. You can't go there. Particularly phosphorus munitions, which, again, linking back to the Russian-Ukraine crisis, there's been a whiff of the use of chemical weapons, allegedly by Russia. That would be phosphorus, which, these poor people saw in World War I as a gas delivered by artillery shell. Phosphorus, of course, burns underwater. Water doesn't put it out. You breathe that in. It burns out your organs, your esophagus, lungs, liquefies it. So yes, it's a horrible weapon of war, which is banned, but obviously still, and yeah, I mean that's the danger. Unexploded ordnance, whether it's a landmine or whether it's a phosphorus shell from World War I, it stays in the ground and it can harm people way into the future. It's that poem also is kind of like looking at, yes, I write about the effect of war on people, but also on landscapes. And again, just watching footage from the Ukraine, you can see again this World War I landscape forming around major cities. You just see the mass destruction which cities and villages and towns in France and Belgium saw in World War I, like complete devastation from artillery barrages, continuous artillery barrages. The whole landscape just transformed into a quagmire, into something from Bruegel, as I pointed out earlier. Like it's just like the eerie kind of similarities between this 2022 conflict and the Great War. From the trenches being dug to the kind of the wooden fortifications inside those trenches, to the use of these terrifying weapons, and towns and cities just being turned into rubble. Like Europe hasn't seen this since World War II, obviously, but it's just, I don't know, it's like there's an effect on the landscape. And I'm just thinking, in 100 years' time, there'll still be munitions from this current conflict that have been buried or lying dormant in the ground, like still possibly affecting residents, in the Ukraine, in those cities 100 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, what struck me about this poem is how, people in my generation can move through the world oblivious. I mean, I was in France in my 20s. I had no idea that there were millions of unexploded ordnances beneath my feet. No idea. I'd heard about, the mines in Cambodia and the mines in Mozambique, but, the memory's short. And so traveling through France in the 1980s, no one was thinking about what happened in 1914 to 1918. But what the poem sort of so poignantly tells us is that even after wars end, they don't end.
Yeah, exactly. There's a legacy. There's a legacy in the built environment. I mean, those villages and towns. If you went through, some of those World War I, World War II, locations in Europe, you can still see, bullet holes in brick walls of houses from those wars. You can still see the effects in the built environment, although much has changed and obviously been replanted and improved and rebuilt. But there's still evidence and an effect on the landscape, like places that, such as the red zone where you can't go. Because of the phosphorus ammunition that's in the ground. And you just see, in the Ukraine, you just see the devastation of, the infrastructure. And I mean, yes, it's been on the built city landscape, a lot of this devastation. But you just look at that and you just can't help but wonder, who's going to rebuild that? How long is it going to stay like that? How long is it going to be sort of scarred and tortured? Like, is it becoming a tortured landscape, like World War I, like World War II?
And the psyche of the Ukrainian people is going to be tortured for eons. I mean, it doesn't stop, does it?
No. And that's, the other similarity, I guess, is the, civilian toll. Yes, there's a death toll on soldiers in war. But, as we know from World War II, there was a high death toll of civilians in that conflict. And that's the other, terrible parallel to World War I, World War II, probably more so, is the deliberate attack on civilians, raining artillery down on people who are non-combatants is a war crime. And, also the deliberate destruction of infrastructure that civilians are dependent upon is also a war crime. Kidnapping, taking people hostage, torturing and executing them is also a war crime. So we're seeing, again, a terrible kind of parallel to World War II, where you had a similar, devastation on cities on both sides. Germany bombs Coventry and, Coventry goes up in flames, and then, Bomber Command changes its strategy to, start hitting German cities. And, Dresden is destroyed in a firestorm. 300,000 people burned to death in Dresden.
After the war, really, unnecessarily.
Yeah, because it was a non-military target. So, that kind of, what Putin's doing and this kind of deliberate, destruction of civilians is uncannily similar to what we saw in World War II. And yeah, so, you look at the images of these cities and you just go, how's that going to be fixed ever?
Yeah.
And obviously, European cities were rebuilt, after World War I and World War II. But as you say, what is the legacy, the effect on people who that's their home, And now you see Ukrainians who initially fled, say 5 or 6 weeks ago, returning to Kyiv and returning to Kharkiv and other major cities that have been bombed. It's like, the pull of home on the civilian, like, this is our home. Where else can we go? So once again, humanity, in this current conflict, is put into this intense furnace of the pull of war music. It's like it takes me away from my home, and yet I go back to it even though it's devastated. And those people who are trapped, in Mariupol, civilians, 100,000 people who still can't get out, and being besieged. There are terrible, terrible parallels to World War II. Ironically, the city of Leningrad, St. Petersburg.
The siege.
That siege, 1.3 million people died in that city of starvation. And that's a greater death toll than Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden and Coventry put together. And yet no one ever talks about Leningrad, the siege, that entrapped millions of people and led to 1.3 million people basically starving to death. That parallel that we're seeing is quite phenomenal and quite scary. What is the human condition to repeat these past mistakes? But so the effect on the landscape, the built environment, where people live, the sense of home and place, like how do you go back to that, if it's totally transformed and destroyed? Like, how do you start again? Many interviews and many Ukrainian civilians, they've lost everything, their houses, the apartment, buildings, cars, jobs, everything's gone. Like it's, but they go back, such as the human heart, the pull of the human heart.
Should we have another poem?
Okay. World War II now. So this is Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Bullwinkle, who is an Australian hero. And she was a nurse in World War II and survived the 1942 Bunker Island massacre. So this is kind of a sonnet about her. Vivian Bullwinkle. They say they who save lives can never understand how they are taken. Tide pool of khaki men and rigid ammo belts so anti-cummerbund. Quick as dance steps, counter-sprung floors of golden sand. Death's a stage trapdoor for most. Nurses, soldiers and salt coffins soak up jungle's exhausted heat. Stay dead by your sisters till the sun's blood pressure drops. We want you as a new recruit. Live to tell the tale. Escape, be captured again. Keep the secret inside you in utero. Let history write you out. Become someone's footnote in his or her thesis and pass. Decline that Australian beach obsession.
So one of the things for me that is a feature of your poems are the opening and closing lines. As a reader, they make me pause and think. Here you begin, they who save lives can never understand how they are taken. And it recalls to me the utter dismay and distress and incomprehension of doctors and nurses at the front line of any conflict, and most recently, of course, Ukraine. And then you end Decline that Australian beach obsession, which in the context of what happened to Vivian Bullwinkle is devastating. I mean, and partly because it's understated.
I just can't imagine her going back to Bondi Beach or something and going for a dip, going for a swim without reliving, I guess, the trauma of that experience. And Australians being so, the Australian beach obsession.
Yes. I mean, it's an extraordinary story of survival.
Yeah.
And you've done this, sonnet condensed form again.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you decide what to leave in and what leave out of poems and what to put into them?
Oh, I think that's the osmosis of, getting the story down on the page and selecting your word choice. There's an intersection between, the type of content you want to keep and get into there. And, so obviously there I'm describing the event, the massacre, on the beach on Bunker Island in 1942. And how she survived. So, Vivian was a tall woman and when the Japanese had lined them up into the surf with their backs to the Japanese and raked them with machine gun fire, she was hit in the hip, whereas other people were hit in the chest, I guess. And so she fell down and, bleeding from the hip, pretended to be dead with her sister nurses in the swell there. As the Japanese, waited out and kind of, made sure that everyone was dead or finished off, the wounded. So she pretended to be dead. And that itself is, such a surreal thing for anyone to picture. You've got to hold your breath. You've got to, I just think, was she lying on her back in the surf, or was she did she roll over onto her stomach and then taking a deep breath and try, to hold her breath and to not have her, body moving, the breathing motion to give it away that she wasn't dead. I just, what she did to survive, as you say. And then, of course, she buried her nurse's uniform, and survived for 12 days with a wounded British private on Bunker Island in the jungle before they surrendered to Japanese forces, and then went into the prisoner of war camp, where he died, and she lived, but was under such a sword of Damocles. It's she couldn't tell anyone about the massacre for fear that her life would be forfeit if the Japanese found out that they knew that what she knew. And then she's in prison for 3 or 4 years, and then only after the war's end can you tell your secret. And she went back to the beach, and she actually found where she buried her uniform, and that was recovered. Miraculously, as evidence for war crimes tribunal, sentencing the people responsible for the massacre. So she was, that was evidence for war crimes tribunal as well. So, yeah, she was a remarkable woman, remarkable Australian, who then went on to become director of nursing at major metropolitan hospitals, and dedicated her whole life to saving people. Again,
I grew up in Adelaide, and she was well known in South Australia.
It's a remarkable story, and again, unfortunately, we've got that contemporary parallel with war crimes and crimes against humanity that we're seeing in this current conflict. Again, it's unfortunately there are parallels, historical parallels to what's going on now, and again, the International Criminal Court and war crimes, lawyers are on the scene, in Kyiv and Bucha and Irpin and Hostomel and the suburbs, outer suburbs of Bovary, of Kyiv. Collecting evidence for a new series of war crimes. Again, parallel to particularly World War II, that is so unfortunate, and we just think, why is this happening again? Why is this being repeated? What's within people that makes them so barbarous? Anyway. So Vivian survived, and she lived to tell her tale, and helped with justice. So all we can hope and think about today is that justice will prevail. And it may take years. It does take years. It takes decades to bring people to justice for war crimes. So that's a whole other saga. That's going to happen whenever this kind of conflict finishes, that people, have to gear up for and will occupy their time, unfortunately.
So now we come to Warrant Officer Keith Payne, who started the whole ball rolling for you.
Yeah. Warrant Officer, Second Class Keith Payne. So this is 24th of May, 1969, Kon Tum Province, South Vietnam. So Payne was an Australian advisor. So he was over there training South Vietnamese troops, and he was attached, along with American advisors, he was attached to an ARVN unit on patrol. And then this happened. He won his VC by saving a lot of lives. You know, just back to that earlier point, you can, you know, kill a lot of people, it can save a lot of lives. And his falls more into like, yeah, he did fight in the action, but he was also recognized for saving many, many lives over a course, again, of, I think, of, 2 days. So, Warrant Officer Class 2, Keith Payne. Prophet wounded in the hands and hip, he cast boiling stones at every bush that burned. A salt dressing lathered his body, stinging his mind to attention as he reeled them back in like tired marlin. By night he stalked his own men, green light footprints his only guide as he snaked over dead leaves, reading the fluorescent logo of squashed roots. His head in decay, with Odysseus's sharpened mind, he ordered men lying doggo to crawl out of night's cave. They clutched at the camouflage fleece and held on. Lethal glowworms fell from trees. The jungle itched with fire as they snuffled away under the giant's pockmarked gaze. As Dark's black boulder descended upon his jettisoned crew, he lifted some light as sugar bags and stole away. He led them out of this raw section, 40 dog-eared pilgrims whose candlelight had gone astray.
Yeah, I'm interested in the references in this poem to Prophet wounded and Odysseus and the camouflage fleece and the giant's pockmarked gaze. Is there something about war and in particular about heroism that we need to mythologize to appreciate or understand?
This is more of a, it's a more of an actual description of his wounds, I guess. He was shot in the hand, and again the hip. For some reason, the hip is an area I don't know that gets hit a lot in these women, and the hands as well. Like a lot of people get wounded in the hands, whether that's shrapnel. I don't know. There's a theme there. It's like a mini theme, the hands and the hip. Maybe that's worthy of a poem in itself. What I like about Payne's action is that he won his VC by rescuing, 40 South Vietnamese soldiers. So, under great kind of risk to himself. After they were sort of ambushed by a NVA kind of like unit. They're kind of like they're retreating. The lines crumbling. They're starting to run away. Payne tries to kind of like reinforce their position. Tries to stop people from running away and to fight and to kind of like re-seize the initiative. But by nightfall, after hours of fighting already, most of that kind of probably a platoon or it's probably half a company are dispersed, and he's got no idea where they are. So he goes out by himself, crawling over the jungle floor, and basically reading the phosphorescence that comes from the decaying leaves. So in the night he could see the footprints in the humus in the leaf litter. He could actually see where people had kind of been walking by this phosphorescence, and he tracked people like that, and then basically found different individuals and groups of men, and basically told them all to go where they'd formed a new perimeter, and basically spent hours and hours, I think it was 10 hours, basically crawling around the forest, recovering these South Vietnamese soldiers and saving their life. And and then they, got the heck out of there. So, again, these weren't even his own countrymen, but that dedication to duty and that dedication to preserving life as much as taking it kind of struck me with pain. And he was a humble guy. Like he's still alive.
He's still alive, yeah.
Yeah. He's still alive.
He's 88.
Living in Mackay. And
did you send him the poem?
You know what? I don't think I have. Wow, that would be a scary thought. Hey, Keith, here's a sonnet about you, and don't hurt me.
He's not the hurting kind.
No. He's kind of where it all started, and it was kind of, he did, from reading about him and looking at photos and doing a bit of background research, he came across as a very, very humble man who just did his job and was focused on saving lives that night, more than taking them, I guess, and did his duty. In terms of mythologizing, again, just going back to my earlier point, I just kind of wanted to tell the story of the action, what they did in kind of just as it happened, I'm not really, applauding or glorifying, through the language like that. Like I tried to avoid that. I'm a left-wing person. I'm not really, into war. I like when there's not war. So, but I do understand, when there's a time for war, say democracy is at threat or something like that, when, democracy has to be protected, that kind of idea. But no, I never aim to mythologize, their actions. It's just really as it happened.
Well, we're gonna run out of time, so I think I'm gonna let you read some more poems.
Okay. All right. So moving into the 21st century. So here's a poem. I actually wrote this just on the the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So that's its title. You rang me at midnight and said, "Turn on the news. Something's weird's happening in America." One stack was already smoking by the time our screen adjusted its focus, but then we realized that other telescreens were still being twisted as the great eye of the world news dilated in shock. Quick zooms and shaky cam tried to adjust to the after effect of a skyscraper swallowing its jet. We were still waking up when the second plane hit. One of us had gone to make coffee and missed it. Some fingers got burned. Our children, not yet born, would see this event 2 decades on and think the deep field image of office papers falling were rock doves dashing themselves against the building as though some unseen compelling force made them fly into it. That was when you and I spoke more often by phone about grand events that happened to us, our superstructure collapsing a decade later.
So most of the poems I've read about 9/11 were relatively contemporaneous. What made you think back to that event 20 years later and connect the historical to the personal as you do in this poem?
Oh, it was a curious time. Like with a lot of, major historical events, people kind of, think about where they were and what they were doing at that time. And it was midnight and I was in bed, and my best friend from high school, who we're still friends with, at that stage I was about 30, I guess. And he rang me up, in Brisbane. I was living in Weranga. and basically said exactly that, like something weird's happening in America, turn on the TV, a building's collapsed, there's been like a plane crash. And then it was like, watching it live as the saga unfolded, the second plane hit, and then both towers collapsed. Whilst trying to adjust to like a morning ritual, so interceded in there are like, everyday rituals, making coffee. You miss something because like your attention's elsewhere. Kind of the everyday pokes its way into that poem. And then also, obviously documentaries came out about it, and my kids who are teenagers now, still in high school, and we were just like watching this as historical truth. And one of them made this comment, "Oh, are they pigeons?" Like not understanding that all the papers coming out of the Twin Towers were from the office, was actual paper. maybe because they're living in I don't know, more of a paperless idiom or something like that. It was like they were kind of like didn't understand what all these kind of like floating, scurrying things caught in the breeze and the terrible vacuum of heat were. And I was struck by that. It was like, that's paper. Why don't you know that? Why don't you understand that? It was kind of like, again, it was an odd dislocation. That an event that's barely 20 years old. I mean, we're not talking World War I, we're not talking World War II, 100 years or 80 years ago. Something that 20 years ago has that fog of understanding around it. I guess it was interesting anyway. And also, it's a poem about my friend, and again, something else that collapsed, which is friendships and the natural kind of erosion of time that you get to spend with people. He now lives in France, so he's now in ruin, a filmmaker, and so we haven't seen a lot of each other over the last, say, 10, 12 years. So it's kind of like, I was thinking about him, and I was thinking about the times when we would talk more, and this was particularly kind of like in regards to this event. So it's just I was just thinking about a time when he called me out of the blue, and this was like one of those times, like your friends sometimes do. And how as you grow older, that kind of like, I don't know, you become a little bit more insular, like maybe not as social as you used to be. It's kind of like there's a sense of that loss in the poem as much as the loss of the Twin Towers and the almost 3,000 people who perished that morning.
I'm just
so there's a lot in that sonnet.
There is.
There's a lot packed into it.
There's a lot in all of them. I just noticed that you skipped a poem. You were going to read War on Terror.
Oh, okay. Okay. This is so in my day job, I'm a high school English literature teacher. So this was kind of reflecting one day, because obviously you teach texts like, you teach war poetry, you do units on war poetry, teach Owen and Sassoon and Rupert Brooke and people and the authors like that, Hardy, and I used to teach at a school out at Ipswich, and the Amberley Air Base, which I think is Australia's second largest air base after Tyndall in the Northern Territory. It's home to, C-17s, the big transport cargo lift jet that we have that, recently took Bushmaster vehicles over to the Ukraine as part of Australia's military support for the Ukraine. I think you can fit 4 at once of those Bushmaster armoured vehicles. It would, fly around often and distract everyone in the classroom. Boys would rush to the windows to have a look at this, this military jet. And there were, Super Hornets stationed out there, and so it's a big RAF airbase attached to Ipswich there. So this is just kind of like just a little sonnet on again, kind of like maybe that distance between like history and kind of experience. War on Terror. They have lived through America's longest war. We analyse Wilfred Owen. Obscene as cancer, they mumble, checking Facebook. Aleppo is on their feed, a dead mother sitting upright holding her dead baby next to her dead toddler, all dusted in concrete flour. Grey ash faces as if in mourning. They do not cry at the end of Gallipoli anymore. They do not understand that rape is a war crime. Teaching English is mostly just teaching history. The Vietnam War is as abstract as disease before vaccinations. They lack context like some bones lack calcium. They form opinions haphazardly. Acne breaks out like a bit of conflict over oil. The Muslim students pray quietly out of sight.
I've always been struck by the phrase war on terror, because it seems to me to be an oxymoron, because war is terror. So, yeah. I mean, you perpetrate terror against terror, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, war's always, war has, always is good for like, adding to the lexicon, creating catchphrases, like the one, from Zelensky I talked about earlier. Mm. I need ammunition, not a ride, things like that. Mm. But yeah, I mean, it's a complete oxymoron, and interestingly, here we sit criticizing Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine and its attack on democracy, which is, totally unjustifiable. And yet in 2003, the US invaded Iraq and ousted Saddam Hussein. And still, I don't think there's been a link to his involvement with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and the attack on the Twin Towers, or, holding weapons of mass destruction. And yet that pretense was put into place and legitimized a war.
And no one was ever brought to account for that. And Russia can point to that and say, well, double standards.
Yeah, and I think they have at times. And again, like that war raged for many years, destroyed cities, many civilians died. Allegedly 150,000 Iraqi civilians died in the war in Iraq. Massive infrastructure damage, again, a ravaged landscape, ravaged cities. And yeah, somehow that's justified, and yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, looking at what Russia's doing, and if they claim that as a historical, pretext, then no one's winning, are they? So I mean, yeah. So that was just a little poem, just about. I don't know, almost, what I observed in students who didn't know a lot about history, unless they did mod history or something like that. Like World War I, World War II's on, in the curriculum, Vietnam perhaps, but kind of, I don't know, weren't affected.
Yeah.
That's a reference to watching Gallipoli, and it's like, at the end of Gallipoli, it's very sad. And like you would analyze these films in conjunction with war poetry and not get an emotional reaction or not get a response that it should garner. I was often kind of like nonplussed by that, I guess.
No, that disconnect can be very shocking, really.
Yeah. So that disconnect. So that poem kind of tries to pick up on that a little bit as well. So yeah. So we're into the into the 21st century.
And your next poem is unlike anything else that you've got for me. Bomb.
Oh, no. Now we're getting into the longer poems. Oh dear,
Yeah.
this will be a 2-hour session. Well, this is a cross narrative. There are two voices, 2 or 3 voices actually going in here. So whilst I was living out at Ipswich, teaching out there, a local incident occurred with a young man who made a homemade bomb and detonated it, or it accidentally went off and injured him. And so the bomb squad was called in, and it was like, like streets of Ipswich kind of shut down, and it was kind of like, like a bomb threat, that kind of level. And it's interconnected with Afghanistan, with a suicide bomber in Afghanistan. Again, a young man who is also kind of coerced into doing a bombing. So in Ipswich, there was a young guy who, this other guy was kind of teaching him how to make, pipe bombs and that kind of thing. And so this is a poem really about coercion of the young into being indoctrinated, I guess. 1, he hands it to me. His fingers a pale spider, the ball its bloated egg sac. His hairs brush mine. Vibrations are sent from the World Wide Web. Between our 2 trunks, string begins to resonate, smooth as a river stone, polished by eons of licks to the face. Dog, nose cold, the ball is dimpled as though struck by meteors of hate. My very own Genesis rock. 2, my vice puts friction's strong law on the golf ball, my industrial popping candy. The drill wheedles its way, twirling through hard white layers like some seismic rig breaking through the Arctic's frozen crust. Scoops of white plastic fall like nail clippings onto the workshop floor. The drill chews the icing down to the quick of its rubber core. Black strings reverse like smoke up the drill's steel chimney. 3, he hands me a backpack. It is asteroid heavy. He says there are butterflies inside it and that if I pull the ripcord, it'll free them. Blue and green wings will fold like hands at the end of loud applause. The great sound of God is in the seashell I hold to my ear as I climb the fence. I tiptoe so as not to shake up my delicate cargo. I don't want to kill the insects. He says the Americans will like me. 4, my very own Genesis rock. He says there's white powder inside that will trigger dreams. I draw the cigarette from behind my ear like a hunting dart from my neck's soft quiver, and he grasps it in one of his pale mandibles. As he transports it to his mouth, a fang jumps out into his lip like a white shark, beaching itself on the red sand of his lips. As he slides back into the liquid light, the tooth snags its prey. He lights it like a fuse. 5, up the drill still chimney, my fingers scour like a huntsman and flick the last whiffs of the golf ball's black innards away. I pack the bearings inside the hollowed out shell like a wasp depositing its eggs into a caterpillar's gut. A time bomb's interminable pause. I shoot up the baby cannonball with my violent mixture. An egg timer fills with soot. Time runs black. I cap the improvised device with old chewing gum like a coin that seals a dead man's fate. 6, the Americans will like me and maybe even decorate my chest with chocolate when I release my gift. Whose heart wouldn't expand at the thought, the velvet texture, the eyelash thin antennae that curl the ends like a question mark, the see-through wings that shift your vision like a kaleidoscope. I marvel at how something so small can bring laughter like a magician's trick. As I reach the soldiers, statues still, their faces lit like new bronze. I feather the cord and a dog barks. 7, he lights it like a fuse. The ball is shiny as volcanic glass, the fused harmony of molecules melted in the sun's surface heat of a violent pyroclastic eruption. I upend it to shake out the white powder like a salt shaker that has become damp. Nothing gives. I bash it on my hand's dinner table. He rounds the garage and ducks low like a demolitions expert. There is a noise like lightning hitting a power line. the skin frays from my fingers like an umbrella that rips in a cyclone. 8. That seals a dead man's tongue. What about who takes him down? The blast is about 20 aerosol cans of laughter lit up by a fire eater's belch. I lose my balance momentarily, like the bottom step missed when dead drunk. There's a whimpering that's not quite dog. I sneak a look. He's witchetty grub bent, a white blob grounded, curled into himself like a kick to the balls in a footy scrum. My smile breaks open like a picked saw. The inky ghost cordite possesses my nose. I'll never run out of weapons. The internet is my ammunition dump. It's cyberpunk. 9. I feather the cord and a dog barks. I ask him for a grown-up cigarette. He takes one from his shirt pocket. It slides out like a white torpedo from its silver tube. He looks into the face of his afterthought. Beneath his helmet, his eyes are half lit, in shadows smudged coal, as if they've gone behind a cloud. As I open the backpack's cocoon, bright wings flick out like a serpent's tongue, and the butterflies are gone. In the sheet lightning sky, helicopters glow like black kites caught in the sun.
I'm glad that you gave that little introduction to the poem, because I was not sure when I read it. I read it a number of times, which voice was whose and what was going on. So it makes more sense with that introduction. Why did you do the mix of the two narratives, really?
I think because there was a conjunction in the time frame of both episodes. So there was an event in Afghanistan, a suicide bombing in an American base, and it was around the same time as this very local Ipswich incident of a young man who, in cahoots with an older person, made a homemade, improvised explosive device out of a golf ball.
Chewing gum.
Yeah, and it blew up and, damaged his hand, and, the bomb squad was called in, that kind of thing. So I think the two events, happened around the same time. And it just struck me, here's two examples of two young men who have been kind of coerced by older men into performing actions which possibly go against their nature, coerced into doing something terribly, terribly, dangerous, life-threatening, different ideological purposes, I guess. But still, the coerced lose out at the end. So, it's a poem about, power, obviously, coercion, a little bit about masculinity and, male risk-taking, that kind of thing as well. But also naivety in the face of, overwhelming ideology that, is always pervasive and sort of sucks people into a narrative. And, there's beautiful lies told in there by the older men, I guess, characters in there to the younger men. Yeah. There's terrible, tragic, naive lies that they tell these younger men about what's going to happen, or why do this, or what's in the bag, or, how this golf ball is going to be used. And I find that the real tragedy of the poem is young people being coerced into doing something against society and against their own nature, I guess. Just that power imbalance. We often see that. Again, the Ukraine-Russia campaign. The Russian army has a lot of conscripts. About 25% of their army are conscripts, just young men who conscripted into the armed forces, who don't really want to be there or be fighting. And you hear interviews with captured Russian soldiers, and they didn't know they were going to invade Ukraine on the 24th of February. They knew they were in a training exercise on the border, and the next thing they knew, they were being sent into attack. Again, that just kind of resonates with this poem.
The cannon fodder approach.
Young men being used as cannon fodder, not really knowing the full story, the full picture, not getting access to the truth. And then we've seen these amazing kind of images of, Ukrainian mothers giving, captured Russian soldiers mobile phones so they can call their mothers back in Russia and tell them that they're okay, that they've been captured, but they're alive. That amazing humanity on behalf of many Ukrainians, which counters, it's a beautiful counterpoint to, the kind of naive cannon fodder you're thrown in there, you don't know what's going on. Amidst the brutality of war, we can glimpse those moments of profound humanity. And that's what I kind of, also aim to write about, to achieve in some of these poems. There was this other image of, in Poland, from the war, Polish parents had left strollers for Ukrainian mothers with small babies and children. Once they got off the train at a particular Polish city, here were free strollers to put their children in that they'd been holding, for hours and hours and hours, escaping the Ukraine. Again, that gesture of humanity, sweeps in and kind of saves the day, or can work to, inspire us against a lot of the negativity around, war. So,
all right, next poem.
Okay. So we're going to the end, are we?
Oh, we've got a few to go. Stu's got 4 to go.
Okay. All right. Now we get to the latter stages of the chronology. So the next 2 poems are from 2012, and this is about the shocking allegations of Special Air Service Australian soldiers also allegedly performing war crimes in Afghanistan. So, which has broken out over the last couple of years. And to Australians and in the light of our Anzac traditions, this kind of action, these events go against the grain of a lot of what the Anzac tradition stands for. So as an Australian and as an audience, it's kind of shocking that these allegations are from 10 years ago, are coming out now to tarnish Australia's kind of fine military record. So it's very interesting. This one's called "Killing the Village Idiot," and that was the idiom which a character in this poem came up with to describe the events of that day, March the 28th, 2012. Takes a young man's life and turns it into an in-joke, a sitcom where the little Aussie battler is not who you think he is, where the laughter dies right down. Takes centuries of military history and compounds it into a nanosecond, a trigger finger's record of brave conduct, that digit calloused by death's overuse. Takes the myth and sullies it, like blackening a serrated blade over a fire to take the gloss off, to hide its bright sheen from media inspection. Who dares wins, Takes over the soundscape of the valley. The fields become an auditorium, a Hollywood bowl, a set. The production is staged. The dead antagonist is dressed gaily in a battle bra. Takes 10,000 years of metallurgy to produce the perfect lead capsule and an instrument to propel it a speed to outrun its own double tap echo. Being dead is the first he hears of it. Takes a disabled young man beaten by the Taliban for not following God's path up into the mountains like a goat, but staying true to his nature, to bolt at the first sign of reprisal. Takes Soldier C all of a few seconds to realise his mistake, a few more minutes to come up with his new idiom, a few hours and a few more beers to obey his culture and innovate. Takes a scan of the man's fingerprints and irises after death to confirm that Zuarden was not matched to anyone on the Special Forces target list, his soul not a computer chip. Takes the initiative away from murder and packages him up at the briefing back at base as a high-value target, a legitimate kill, this time planting magazines on his body, not radios. Takes his commendation for gallantry and tarnishes it. But Alexander had great problems in Kandahar too, the tribe's resistance so fierce he had to marry one for a hall pass. Takes a witness who wishes to remain anonymous to show more bravery than on any battlefield, to state what he saw, that he saw the farmer's brain hit the ground before his own body did. Takes his relative to be interviewed by the Aussie press, to set the story straight 8 years later, to recalibrate hatred, to want the murderer shot and torn into pieces like a curse. Takes some disbelief from you and me, takes the country of your birth you thought you knew so well, and executes everything you've ever felt in a red poppy field.
The repetition of the word takes at the start of every stanza very effectively and relentlessly emphasizes the taking of a man's life and everything that goes with it. But this poem made me pause. And this is another devastating poem, a damning indictment of the corruption of war and the committal of war crimes. And what you see in it is a bunch of things. You see a failure of character, you see the failure of judgment, you see the appalling commitment of the crime, and then the appalling reframing of it, the rationalizations, justifications, excuses, the failure to take responsibility. And, you know, it's appropriate that the poem is disgusted by this, that we are disgusted by this. We do it from the comfort of peace and the time to think about what occurred. And war often takes its protagonists away from that, so that, you know, morality is suspended, if you like. Action occurs without thought. It's easy for brutality to manifest. I mean, what
the first casualty in war is truth. Yeah.
Well, what terrifies me is that any one of us put in that position might do the same thing. You don't know.
Absolutely.
It's terrifying.
Unless, I mean, that's a very good point. You know, poets can write from peace. You know, very, very, very few. You know, there's you know, Wilfred Owen got to write from war. You know, commanding his men as a captain. You know, he was there. He experienced it. That comes across in his poetry. You've got a point about, you know, it's all right for us to sit here, you know, in peace, in safety, and to comment on the moral actions of other individuals, without knowing, exactly, you know, what people go through. And I guess, you know, one of the most tragic things about our 20 years in Afghanistan, our longest war as well, is that we lost, you know, maybe 40 Australian soldiers in combat in Afghanistan. And we've lost far more in peacetime in Australia.
From suicide.
You know, through suicide.
Yeah.
More than 150, you know, veterans have taken their own lives who served in Afghanistan. According to Wounded Heroes and, you know, charity organisations like that who look after veterans. So coming back to peace is not peaceful at all to soldiers, to many soldiers, and to me, I mean, I can, you know, comment on the, you know, indiscriminate actions that occurred very rapidly, you know, in a battle situation, in that way. But yeah, you know, I do take your point. It's you know, if you were there, you know, how different would the poem sound? You know, I mean, as I pointed out, you know, the few whistleblowers who were there, who, you know, have remained anonymous, but have actually, you know, talked to journalists about what they witnessed. And this is including, you know, American door gunners and people who weren't Australian, you know, who witnessed, you know, events like these. It's hard for us to judge, you know, those nanosecond, like I pointed out, you know, that the kind of those actions that occur in nanoseconds that are reflexive, that, you know, people are trained for. I mean, that's one thing. I think that poem also looks at, you know, you mentioned it, the cover up, which again is done when you've cooled down, you're out of the combat zone, you're back at base, and you're talking with your mates, and you're kind of like colluding to come up with a cover story to hide a war crime. I think there might be two sections there, you know, one being, yes, it's hard to judge the moral actions of others in combat, you know, particularly in an environment where, you know, the enemy is not, you know, obvious, not in uniform, that kind of thing, you know, which you know, was the war in Afghanistan, even the war in Iraq, and the war against, you know, ISIS and ISIL. We're dealing with combatants who don't look like you do. But I think the second part of that poem looks at, well, after everyone's cooled down.
Yeah, and it's just as appalling, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, it's hard to tell which is the most appalling point of that story. The actual, you know, alleged war crime, or the cover up of the alleged war crime. But yeah, you know, it kind of saddens me as an Australian who, you know, I, you know, have been to a lot of dawn services. I'm proud of our kind of, you know, record in 20th century wars, World War I, World War II. You know, Vietnam's a different game, and the war on terror. Again, you know, I consider it a little bit dubious. And maybe that's whole part of the problem, where we get, you know, poor lack of judgment in events like this. You know, for 20 years, you know, after the withdrawal of, you know, American and forces from Afghanistan, it seems to have, you know, not solved any of the problems that Australian troops went over there to try and solve.
There's more grey than there is black and white, isn't there? I mean,
definitely. So I don't know, you know, was it worth the effort? Was it worth those 40 Australian lives over there and the more than 150 here? The families of those veterans, you know, was it worth it, you know, to lose their loved ones in something that was perhaps dubious to begin with? I don't know. Yeah, look, again, it's poetry. It raises more questions than it answers.
Let's go to the next poem because we're going to run out of time.
Oh, look. Maybe I should just skip to a last poem.
Well,
or do you want me to keep on going?
I want you to keep on going because I think there's something in these poems that are worth hearing.
All right. So this next one is from the same year, 2012. This is the 15th of December, 2012. And interestingly, a similar character from the previous poem pops up in this one. This is called The Tractor Job. Again, a invented idiom to describe the alleged actions of Australian soldiers on that day. The Tractor Job. For Abdul Salim, aged 13. You only got to drive your stepfather's Ford tractor. You can't remember the model number tattooed along its front panel's steel forearm a few times before you gave up on the idea of becoming a farmer. It was his trick inviting you up into the cab's open capsule to bond over ripping up the white earth. filling in for a father's duty to pass on life skills to a new son. A kind of ritual, you suppose, shutting your book, your mother telling you to go outside and get some air. A rite of passage carried out in the back blocks, a debutante ball for boys who didn't dance with local girls. Self-doubt seeded long before any rich harvest of youth was gathered. The mountains, a dark sash wrapped around the earth's middle. You got the hang of cultivating, though, as you rode shotgun with you, keeping the front wheels out of divots, going around the field, churning up sandy clods and weeds with steel tines that dug into the loam with a dull heaviness valley teenagers picked up who didn't quite belong here. Those arrow-headed tines, polished bright as a silver horse bit, rang a tune as they tapped the earth's drum, a tan skin that stretched taut from horizon to horizon, the tractor's war noise vibrating over to the next village. The Ford was painted blue with a white trim, a copy of the Southern Cross flag you'd once seen in a market, complete with its bright points of starlight, where the paint job had rubbed off the chassis by close contact with boulders and almond nut trees. You waved from the pilot's seat as your stepfather left you, clambering down metal steps like an astronaut alighting on greyish regolith. Besides, you had the hang of it after your 20-minute crash course, he'd said. He'd be back later to check when the fuel ran out. At first, you felt panic. Stories of tractors overturning on steep hills and crushing their drivers filled your mind like a dark sutra. But when you didn't die outright, you fell into a groove, tires the height of a grown man's head obeying your every turn of the spoke. Rubber revolution broke apart the soil's resistance to change. But for all your youthful success, you still couldn't recall the tractor model's number to the older farm kids' satisfaction, who all looked at you askance on the monthly bus ride into school. Your folk tales of giving soil a good workup, of helping scarce water to drain better, of bringing nutrients to the surface, all for nothing, for a lack of horsepower, manhood's machinery more interested in the velocity of figures. Your breakout pressure too light as your stories failed to dig up any godly glory. Then one crisp blue day, sitting around at Smoko with the men, your tractor still as a resting beast, just before you began loading hand grenade-sized onions. Redbeards fell on your party like vultures on goats. The dervish wind kicked up a brown fog and misted everything as you hid under the Ford like a kid in its mother's fleece. Good steel to protect you from the foreigners' sharp beaks. Man-shapes materialised in the dun pall as if from legend. Dust devils who'd take your soul. But you could not be sure as you hugged a black tyre like an ancestral shield. The earth was cool on your cheek as you knelt wrapped under the tractor's shadowy wing. Wheel grease rubbed onto your chin as though you were a mechanic repairing a leak. Any day now, your stubble would break through.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle to find anything more haunting than what war does to children. But I didn't know this story. How did you find out about Abdul Salim?
Oh, well, it's all come out with the ABC investigative report into the alleged war crimes in between 2008 2012, and a lot of it has come out about one of my VC sonnet individuals, Corporal Ben Robert Smith, who was involved in litigation with news media over defamation around that that he was also partaking in some of these actions. So when it all broke, and obviously lawyer K, the Australian government stepped in to swat the whistleblower, that kind of thing. I started to look into it then when there was adverse government reaction to blowing the whistle on our most elite forces alleged behaviours. So it came out around then, and on that day 16 civilians lost their lives in the village, 16 farmers, and including a 13, 14-year-old boy as well. and they were killed around the tractor. They were killed, around the irrigation system, the onion field. They tried to run away, but the Black Hawks kind of surrounded them, and machine gun fire made them stop. And in the rush and heat of battle, mistakes were made, and so it's kind of one of the worst alleged war crime incidents with Australian armed forces ever, perhaps. So that poem, there's a bit of me in there as a teenager growing up on the farm. That Ford tractor is my stepfather's Ford tractor.
Okay.
His attempts to teach me to drive the tractor and to cultivate are, this character's attempts to fit in. I had this kind of teenagehood on the farm where, because my mother remarried a friend of my father's, and I was suddenly out on a cattle and cereal property by myself when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, by myself. I kind of rejected a lot of the farming practice. Like my parents would sell vealers, like 6-month-old cows to market. And I remember I would try to blockade the trucks to prevent them from taking the cattle away. I'd throw stones when they were treated after my efforts came to naught. I was kind of a weird kid, I guess, growing up on the Darling Downs in that local area. I didn't fit in with the other kids from the farms on the bus. I didn't know what the tractors were called. I didn't know anything about their engines, the numbers on, what it meant. All of that kind of masculine mechanical stuff was so foreign to me. I just had my room read books, like Murray took my rifle for long walks. No, I didn't even have a rifle. My stepfather tried to make me shoot a fox once with an old rickety 22, and I just missed and missed and missed and missed. I just didn't kind of fit in with the values and beliefs of 1980s, Queensland, Darling Downs, just having come out of, 20 years of the Joh Bjelke-Petersen right-wing government, and the monoculture that existed where I grew up. That's where I first got into environmentalism and kind of my eco-poetry was just growing up in that environment where most of the forest cover was gone. The Brigalow acacia forest was destroyed by monoculture. So I kind of thank my strange childhood for that. But there's a lot of me in this boy who doesn't quite fit in, who has a go at trying to fit in, but is still kind of, their identity is still formulating. They're still, filled with self-doubt. Self-doubt about their masculinity, self-doubt about, their ability to achieve anything. And then, the terrible, terrible, revelation at the end of that poem where he didn't get to have an adulthood, to realize any of those dreams. So that's, it's, I kind of wrote that poem, there's a bit of me in there as a gawky, awkward teenager who didn't quite fit into the farming value system. Look, we had neighbours who wanted us to cut down the remaining trees in our property because the galahs used to roost in them and attack their sorghum crop, used to use it as a base to launch their aerial assault on the neighbour's sorghum. And they were always pestering, my parents to cut down the rest of the coolabah trees, the eucalypts, to prevent the galahs, from getting their sorghum crop. And, when my parents sold in 2006, those neighbours bought the property, and guess what the first thing they did? Yeah, they got their wish. They knocked down the remaining trees. So things like that I grew up with, the dominant masculinity. If you didn't fit in, you were ostracised, teased. There was a because my father had died when I was 8, there was a gap in my kind of education around being a man, I guess. I couldn't fix a bike, couldn't, use a pump, couldn't, didn't know anything about engines. And then I didn't, I tried, I guess, with my stepfather to kind of like, fix that up, but no. I kind of left the property just kind of with very different values to my mother, particularly, and my stepfather, around lots of different issues in life. So, yeah. But at least I got to go on to, become an adult. And
Yes.
several characters in that poem didn't.
Your next poems are, strangely enough, set in Kiev.
Yeah, this is a recent one. And it's actually being published. There was a magazine in the UK, Symptody, doing a bit of an anthology on the Ukraine war. So I kind of like just, it's a recent one, I guess. The Ghost of Kiev. So in the first week of the war, this legend appeared, a Ukrainian pilot who they nicknamed the Ghost of Kiev. Yeah, I'll just read it. It's pretty self-explanatory. The Ghost of Kiev. Your son shows you a TikTok clip. You both play Russian computer games, simulators that glorify World War II, mid-century armor, and the Cold War era, where each new development increased penetration, rounds that defeated steel's stubborn thickness. You watch your son take to the skies over maps of Ukraine, 1941, get shot down a lot. The next best thing to flying solo. Through his phone's cracked canopy, he plays you a black streak over Kiev, a medieval barbed arrowhead punching through the sky's grey cuirass. For 50 years, the fulcrum has been idle. 3 upgrades, engines, radar, missiles, but never seen combat. 70s bones good enough to mix it over the capital with its modern successors, flankers and frog feet, a retro jet where the Ghost got good purchase from his re-engineered multi-role fighter. That first ace in a day in 50 years, not since Alarm's F-86 Sabre rattled in the Indo-Pakistani War, as the aerial world revelled in 6 kills in one day. Your son doesn't bother to fact-check the video, sold on social media's bravado, a pilot's last stand. He tells you the Ghost was shot down, but ejected, his short clip trimmed to fit.
Yes.
So, war gives us its heroes, and I guess, whether the whole story is true or not, there's definitely Ukrainian pilots who have been resisting, the aerial dominance by the Russians. Russia still doesn't dominate the skies, so whether there was an actual pilot who did that, there's now, a new urban legend. So it's kind of like, I guess, crucial in creating, hope and stoicism in the Ukrainian people. So it's kind of like, it might be true, it might not be true. But even if it isn't true, it certainly did its job of kind of like, garnering patriotism and that kind of thing at those times when war is needed, when you need to resist, an aggressor, if your democracy, for example, is threatened. So, so, and it's just kind of like, again, it's kind of commenting on our media usage also.
Yeah, social media, computer games, board games and computers, yeah.
And, my son and I do have an interest in World War II, World War One, and, there are lots of simulators. In fact, there's been, footage of like computer game simulation that people have mistaken for real kind of combat in the Ukraine-Russian war. So it's kind of like a weird, uncanny valley almost effect of, hang on, people think that this is real footage, but but it's not. It's actually, really, because, some of the games that are available today are really realistic, and it's hard to actually tell whether it's filmed news reportage or actually just computer game footage. Mm-hmm. And people have been, trying to sort of create almost like some fake news around that. Yeah, so that's interesting as well. Like, in this very advanced technological world, we have the ability to fake even battle nowadays. So that's interesting. So it's kind of a comment on social media usage. Trimming the clip is like, when you play these war games, you can actually record, your battles, and you can trim the clip, and put it up onto your YouTube station, and people, can follow you for watching your, these kids who just follow YouTubers who are gamers, who just show them, clips of them battling. It's kind of an odd world.
It's very surreal, isn't it?
Surreal, what's more surreal, that or, the real conflict that's going on in the Ukraine? Yeah.
You got one last poem for us, Brett.
Okay. This is a poem called First. It's from a couple of years ago. We had this phenomena on an Anzac Day several years ago. Yasmin Abdel Magid, the public intellectual writer, when she was living in Australia. And you know this, David, you remember she, I think this was on Twitter, she wrote 7 words which got her kicked out of the country. Mm. And I just thought, oh my goodness, isn't there an argument for, the Australian sacrifice in all wars is also about, defending the right of Australians to speak on issues that sometimes are a bit awkward or upsetting. I mean, isn't that what the sacrifice is for? Is for protecting some ideals of democracy, and one of those being, the right to speak. But those 7 words landed her in trouble. She had to leave the country, and this is what she wrote: "Lest we forget," using the Anzac moniker. And then in brackets, Manus, Nauru, Syria, Palestine, and obviously alluding to, detention and the war in Syria and the Palestinian conflict. So, and I thought the reaction was a bit of an overreaction. I mean, considering Syria and Palestine have also been countries where Australians have fought and died in as well. Anyway, so this was kind of, for her, this is called First. And I guess the metaphor is about, not drying up our democratic kind of choices, that kind of idea. First, rainwater is pooled like ammunition gathered for a last stand. Men who have not showered for days count water bottles like precious rounds as the sky attempts to break the siege, keep their supply lines open. But by midday, the sun cuts off the rescue mercilessly as its rays bright tracer dissolves moisture. A medic's bandages absorbing blood. It's hard to keep fighting without fresh water. Australians learned this the hard way at Gallipoli, where plus 40-degree heat killed the body's appetite for slaughter. The real enemy was not the Turks, but bureaucrats thousands of miles away who never went thirsty. Their liquid lunches toasted our national success in killing 10 times the number of the enemy, in making gains for the empire's last shout. Dehydration massacred the wounded on both sides. Men not slain outright were tortured for days as organs collapsed, wet, weak bags shed of their seed. Prisoners spied canteens passed back and forth, but not to them. Butchers who only obeyed their pride's orders poured water out before the wilting detainees. Their souls dank, a demonstration of power's terrible thirst that can never be slaked.
That last line, that sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, Brett, why bother writing that whole thing? Just keep your first and last lines and just write couplets. I think that's the lesson learned today, David, is the middle bit, whatever. Just keep your last lines.
I'll just write writing couplets. The middle bit, but if you look at a demonstration of power's terrible thirst that can never be slaked. Isn't that Vladimir Putin? I mean, isn't that exactly what's going on?
Yeah. That's all levels. That's individual choices in war. That's the leaders of countries and their individual decisions to go to war. That's everyone who has an inkling of power and what to do with it. Interestingly, that poem at the end kind of it melds into that poem. It melds at the end. I kind of like the fact that it could be describing our Gallipoli campaign and the terrible conditions. I went to Gallipoli once, when I was 30, on a bit of a backpacking tour of the world. I only got to Shrapnel Valley because my wife and I tried to hitchhike from Chinukali across the Bosphorus, and then we didn't take the minibus, like the tourist minibus from the hostel. We thought, oh, no, we'll get there ourselves. We'll save some money. And we ended up going in the wrong direction once we got across to the small town, the opposite side of the Bosphorus Strait. And we went around the bottom of the peninsula, Cape Helles, where the British landed actually. And we ended up at a Turkish army base. And as you do. And I remembered talking to the soldier who was on guard duty who didn't understand English. And then I think like an officer came out and kind of like wanted to know what we're doing, these two Australian tourists who were lost. And I think eventually we were pointed in the right direction. But interestingly, on the way around Cape Helles, we passed several things. We passed a dead donkey for one. We passed a land tortoise and sort of like rescued it off the road. And there was a cemetery, cemeteries everywhere on the peninsula, but there was one, it was a Turkish war cemetery. And when we were there was a Turkish family all around a tomb praying for an ancestor, obviously, who died in World War I. And the whole family the extended family was there. And we were just sort of like quietly observing their mourning, I guess, for an ancestor so long lost. And it just struck me that, that was such a beautiful thing to see. Whereas here we might, not act in that same way. It's a moment that always stick with me. And then obviously we got back to that little town, and then we did catch like some kind of mini bus up to Shrapnel Valley, and as the day was over and we couldn't get any further. But it was so hot. I mean, this is like August, September, and 40-degree temperatures. Yes, water is of a necessity. Running out of water is not a good thing. So kind of the conditions were quite extreme. And so it kind of like, this idea in thirst is sort of comes from that.
Well, it's both literal and metaphorical, isn't it?
Yeah. But also that thirst for power as well. And, language like rainwater, it shouldn't run out. It should be allowed to, water access to everyone, like democracy and access to speech for everyone. And, we should be a society that respects the right of people's voices. And what happened to Yasmin is just, it's a kind of thing that you think of Russia and journalists being silenced and imprisoned and even killed. You think of media being restricted in other countries, like you do with war crimes too. And when it comes to us, when it hits our home, it's like, wow, it's like, oh my goodness. It can happen here as well, and that's a good lesson to learn. And I think, out of all of this, I guess we have to learn, to be human again, and to be always human. And the good things that come with that, justice and duty and resilience and preservation and laughter and finding a positive in a lot of this negative at the moment. So, yeah.
Well, Brett, that's been fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing poems and insights on the theme of war music. And you've told me that all of your books are out of print, but that your forthcoming book, The Wet Tropics, will be published in September 2022. If you send us the link to that once it's out, we'll put up a link to that book with the podcast once it's been published, so that people can get a hold of it. It's going to contain 100 sonnets, is it?
Oh no, it does have sonnets. No, but not a single poem about war.
Okay, all right.
This is a book that's just it's like the last decade of me writing about the environment. So it's about extinction, it's about endangered animals, birds, it's eco poetry, it's 40 poems. Coming out in September.
All right, thank you so much once again. We'll return in May with Maria Takalanda on the theme of transforming pain through poetry. See you then.
Thank you.